And 3, 2, 1.
Hi, everyone. It's great to see the participant numbers rising every second. We'll just give it a few moments to let people join in the call. But perhaps if you feel like it, why don't you share where you are dialing in from in the chat so we can get a sense of who's part of the community today. New Jersey, Mexico City. Awesome. I'm calling in from Hampshire in the UK. So I'm a bit of an outsider today. Fantastic. So I'm going to give it another 30 seconds or so before we kick off. Really looking forward to today's event. Okay, so I'll kick off now. So welcome everyone. It's fantastic to have you all with us. For this year's Mental Health Awareness Month, we're calling for connection beyond our phones, beyond our screens, and beyond our tablet feeds. And we all know what loneliness feels like. And over the past 2 years, this has intensified for many people due to things like social isolation and disconnection. So many of us have turned to our digital devices, seeking out connection and trying to be together virtually. So the devices on our laps and in our hands and our tabletops, they offer unlimited ways to connect with others, but they do also present some problems. They present a never-ending treadmill of content to run through. And too often we find ourselves perhaps seeking belonging and instead finding bite-sized boredom fillers. So we go in looking for togetherness and find ourselves scrolling alone. So I'm sure we've all heard of doom scrolling. We know that that's been found to increase feelings of anxiety and stress and loneliness. And the data shows that doom scrolling peaks during times of crisis. And we've definitely seen this rise throughout the pandemic and obviously spike again now with the Ukraine war. So the invitation here today is for us to explore ways to potentially break the habit and get to a better place. And for some, that will be spending time with others. For others, it might be finding quality time alone. Because like when I think about this, it's, finding true connection with ourselves, with others, and with life, really. To me, that's the heart of this discussion today. So my name's Steve Peralta. I'm the co-founder of Unmind. And today, I and you are joined by some fantastic expert guests who can help us understand how we got where we are today, how to navigate the challenges ahead of us, and crucially, how we can support ourselves and those around us. So before I introduce our wonderful guests to you, I'd just like to make everyone aware of our Unmind community guidelines. So we want to foster an environment of openness, of inclusion, of psychological safety for both the attendees and the panelists. And so, we ask everyone to please adhere to our Unmind community guidelines. So these are that we encourage everyone's voice to be heard. So please do join in the conversation and share your stories in the chat. We acknowledge that some conversations from event to event might be triggering. And so we will always share any trigger warnings at the start of the session. Emotional topics are often full of nuance, so please give each other time to listen and understand. But ultimately, probably the golden rule is please treat panelists and fellow attendees as you would like to be treated. So finally, direct questions can often get missed in the chat, so please do try and save them for the Q&A section at the end. You feel free to post your questions in the Q&A box during the chat, and I will pick out some for our guests to answer towards the end. So on that note, I'd like to welcome our fantastic guests today. So first of all, Dr. Jeremy Noble. Jeremy is a professor at the Harvard School of Public Health and founder of the Unlonely project, which uses the creative arts to raise awareness and reduce the stigma associated with loneliness. So welcome, Jeremy.
Pleasure to be here, Steve.
Then I'd like to welcome Dr. Julianne Holt-Lundstad, a TED speaker and expert in social connections research. So Julianne's focused on the long-term health effects of social connection and is currently a member of the technical working group for the UK cross-departmental loneliness team. Welcome, Julianne.
Thank you.
And finally, we have Catherine Price. So Catherine's been referred to as the Marie Kondo of brains, which is an awesome title. Catherine's also an award-winning journalist and author whose latest book is called The Power of Fun, How to Feel Alive Again. So welcome, Catherine.
Thank you very much.
So yeah, it's great to have you with us. I thought maybe you could take a minute or so each to tell us a bit more about yourselves and also when you last felt truly connected. And perhaps we start with Catherine.
Sure. I am a science journalist by training, not a Marie Kondo by training, although I do greatly admire her method. And my two most relevant books are a book called How to Break Up with Your Phone, which is about creating more intentional relationships with our devices. And then the unintentional follow-up to that is the one you referred to, which is The Power of Fun, How to Feel Alive Again. And as part of this initiative to help people scroll less and live more, I also created something called screenlifebalance.com, which is meant to be a resource hub to help people reconnect with real life and have more intentional relationships with technology. So the last time I felt connected was actually, I would say last night. I started taking a guitar class, which actually inspired The Power of Fun. And we now have a habit after class of hanging out together. My entire class, we just transfer over to this parking lot next to the music studio and we play music together. So just last night, I had a lot of wonderful connection through music.
Oh, that sounds brilliant. Thank you, Catherine. Julianne.
Thanks. First off, I should probably make a clarification in your introduction. That must have come from an older bio because the cross-departmental loneliness technical team, I'm not sure of the exact title, is something that is now complete and done. But since that time, I also served on a committee with the National Academy of Science that issued a consensus report on social isolation and loneliness among older adults, which came out right before the pandemic. But I'm also the scientific chair for the Foundation for Social Connection. And so much of my work not only is focused on the science, but bridging that that divide between evidence and practice. And how do we really take the science and apply it in ways that can benefit society. And then I guess the second part of the question is, when did I feel most connected recently? I would say it was just a couple days ago. I had dinner with my husband and my two boys, and afterwards played games. And it's something that we started doing during the pandemic because everyone was home and we were able to play games together. And it's just kind of been a fun thing that we've kept up, and it was just fun to not only spend time together, but to laugh and all the things that sometimes don't happen when you have teenage boys. When they sometimes they'd rather be with their friends.
I love it. Thank you so much, and thanks for the correction as well, Julianne. And Jeremy.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. So as you said in the introduction, I am a medical doctor, also, but more of a public health practitioner these days, also a poet, and I'll come back to that. I am on the Harvard faculty, both in the Harvard Medical School, but also the T.H. Chan School of Public Health. But a lot of my work related to loneliness actually is through a nonprofit foundation that you mentioned, the Foundation for Art and Healing. And that's been around almost 20 years, but our focus on loneliness through Project Unlonely actually has been around 6 years. We started in 2016. And it's a real pleasure to be with Julianne because a lot of the decision to start that project was based on her work starting in the early 20-teens. And then I reached out to Julianne, we had some conversations. And as a public health practitioner, I began to see the immensity of loneliness as a personal and public health issue. So Project Unlonely is focused on loneliness. It has 3 goals. One is to increase awareness of loneliness and its toxicities, which is why events like this are so important, Steve. So thanks to Unmind for that. The second is to reduce the stigma that surrounds loneliness. I'm sure we'll talk a little bit about how that stigma has shifted a little bit, since saying you're lonely now doesn't necessarily imply that you're inadequate, worthless, or at risk for abandonment the way it may have in the past, because we're all facing the common enemy of the pandemic. And yet it's still a very difficult word for many people. So we address the stigma of it. And the third thing is to put programs out there in communities so that people can develop not just the awareness, but the skills and the motivation and the ability to have the authentic connections that makes them unlonely. So, and in terms of my personal most recent connectedness, it was really just 2 days ago. I had the pleasure of hearing an incredible poet, Ed Hirsch, who MacArthur Award-winning poet and many books of poetry. He's come out with a new one, actually, looking at the relationship of poetry and democracy. And he characterizes 40 American poets and their poems and why they're so important to connection, really, right now. And I didn't really anticipate it would be about that. But the connection we all felt is a few people went to dinner afterwards. And to have the incredible creative intensity of poetry be followed by authentic personal conversation was really a remarkable experience. I think we all felt it. And so that was, I'm just delighted. And then to be followed so quickly by this event where I actually anticipate we'll all feel more connected after the hour together.
Thank you. I agree, Jeremy. And you're all doing such amazing work. So, thank you so much for that. So I guess let's get into it. Now, I know this isn't a black and white answer, but my first question to all of you is, has digital technology helped or hindered togetherness? And Catherine, I'll start with you first.
All right. Jump right in. I think that that's done both. I think that there's good things and bad things when it comes to connection with our technology. And the good thing is obviously the fact that we can do things like this that we're doing right now, is connect over time and space and be with each other. I don't think anyone would have wanted to have gone through, especially the early stages of the pandemic, without technology. So it has that capability. But, I hear from literally thousands of people, I've heard from people around the world in writing How to Break Up with Your Phone, just about how isolated and lonely their relationships with digital technology make them. And I think there's a profound irony in the fact that many of the tools that are there to quote unquote connect us, like social media, end up making us feel more alone. And I also think one of the lesser acknowledged impacts that technology has on our feeling of connection is not just what we're doing on the devices, but what we are not doing because of the way we're interacting with our devices. So if we're not fully present with the people that we're with in real life because we're checking Twitter or what have you, then that's kind of a side angle of how technology is negatively impacting our ability to feel connected.
It sounds like somewhat of a double-edged sword. Julianne and Jeremy, do you have anything to add to what Catherine said?
Julianne, maybe you first.
I'm happy to jump in. I would, echo that. The short answer is both. But as a scientist, there are never short answers, and that of course it's it's very nuanced and particularly in terms of the evidence as well, and that depending on the context, how it's used, who's using it, this can potentially help or hinder. And I think, of course, each one of us individually can think of times in which it may have helped or hindered, even within an individual. And then, of course, we know that there are variations across individuals. But in essence, the scientific evidence is quite complex. And so without going into too much detail, in essence, just recognizing that there is evidence of both where it might help and where it can hinder.
So Jeremy, does it go beyond the motivation and the awareness when engaged with digital technology? Like, what are some other
I think it does. I mean, I think it gets to very specific aspects of what you actually do when you're on that phone. And just to speak to the complexity of the science, so we do the Unlonely work in 3 populations generally: older adults, working populations, which is a lot of people, and college campuses, because the loneliest demographic adult demographic in many studies seems to be 18 to 24. So that's not everybody in that demographic is at college, but many are. And the advantage of delivering program solutions through college is you at least have a kind of shared identity so that you can actually deliver the programs. And so one of the colleges we're working with, a large Midwestern college, I won't say which one, but we help them measure loneliness in their population and also other habits. And the group of students who said that they had significant frequency of binge drinking, which we know is a college problem, were less lonely. So you have to be careful. They gave them a sense of belonging, connection, authentic friendships, and yet it's a very toxic way to achieve that kind of goal. And so we have to be careful when we say, okay, social media makes you lonely. There's quite a lot of well-done studies that show in certain ways it's being used, it does make people lonely, anxiety, depression, and so forth also follows that. I think it's about just conscious use of digital technology, like we have to be conscious about everything else, like how we drive, how we walk down the street, how we have conversations. And I think the most helpful thing we can be doing for ourselves and others is to explore loneliness, get curious about it, so that when we have crappy ass experiences on our phone that make us feel terrible, we stop doing them and move towards things that are more helpful. Like, you know, and there are any number of things we could talk more about what those are. We'll go into them now.
Yeah, we can definitely elaborate on that soon. Like, it reminded me of a chat we had the other day where one of the points of advice was check in with yourself when using the digital technology and how's it making you feel. And that could be quite a good indication in the moment of whether it's helpful or not. And I guess we're talking about loneliness here. I'm guessing it's not as straightforward as just simple loneliness. It's probably a bit more nuanced than that. So I thought I'd start with you, Julianne. Could you speak to what loneliness is and perhaps share some of the most important findings from your research or other research that can help us all get on the same page when it comes to loneliness?
Yeah. I think we often use the term loneliness very broadly. And so, it's important to maybe define what we mean by it to make sure that we're all talking about the same thing. And so, of course, I come from a scientific perspective. And so we look at the ways in which it has been measured and conceptualized. And distinguished from other kinds of related topics. So for instance, we often use the terms social isolation and loneliness interchangeably. But these are actually distinct. And so, for instance, social isolation is more objectively being alone, having few relationships or infrequent contact. Whereas loneliness is more of a subjective feeling. People might say they feel alone or feel isolated, but it's often defined as the discrepancy between one's actual level of connection and one's desired level of connection. And so, of course, these things often go hand in hand, because if you're objectively alone, you're more likely to feel alone. But they don't always go together. And in fact, you can be isolated but not feel lonely. You might take pleasure in that solitude. And conversely, you can be isolated, you can be not isolated, so surrounded by other people and yet still feel profoundly lonely. And so I think that helps distinguish between those two. But it's also, I think, helpful to think about it in terms of how some neuroscientists have conceptualized it, and in the sense of throughout human history, we have required and needed to rely on others for our survival. And so when we lack proximity to others, it can, and particularly trusted others, it can feel, that can be a very vulnerable and dangerous place to be. And so it's thought that loneliness may be somewhat of a biological motive, much like hunger and thirst, that motivates us to reconnect. And so from that standpoint, loneliness might be viewed as this biological drive or motive. It's this unpleasant feeling that is trying to motivate us to take care of a biological need that is adaptive. And so when we think about it in that sense, what that would suggest is that not only is that feeling important, and I can talk more about what that feeling can do to our biology, but it also means we need to actually satisfy that need, right? We don't want to just mask the symptom. We need to actually satisfy that need. And if we take that same analogy, and this gets into some more nuance, is, we wouldn't want to just give people any kind of food, because we know that some food isn't necessarily as nourishing as others, and it could be spoiled. That we also need to take into account the quality of our connections to others as well. And so we can think about loneliness as part of that bigger picture of how we need to fulfill that need, that social need. But it's an incredibly important signal that we need to change something, right? And if left too long, so in the short term, it's very adaptive and a very normal response that every single one of us experiences. But in the long term, can potentially lead to very detrimental health outcomes, including increased risk for a variety of chronic illnesses and increased risk for premature mortality.
Thank you. There's been a lot of really interesting stuff there. I think the idea of it being a motivation to connect is really interesting, and a subjective feeling. And I'd like to, maybe not right now, but dig into this a little later. Motivation to connect to what? Because anyway, I'll leave it at that for now. But I'm not bringing it into the conversation. But I mean, Jeremy or Catherine, do you have anything else to build on there?
I do, and I actually don't want to leave it for later. I want to leave it for right now about what this connection is, because I think it's critical. First of all, I think Julianne just put together in 3 or 4 minutes an incredible and very valuable way to invite people to think about loneliness. And I think this evolutionary signal is really an important idea. I first heard it from a researcher in loneliness named John Cacioppo, who had an untimely early death, unfortunately, but he was so generous in his time as I was trying to figure out, like, what is loneliness? He wrote a book on it around 2008, and he really kind of laid a foundation, as with some other researchers, to really understand why it is so powerful for us. And I think that pointing towards the evolutionary model for it, as Julianne suggested, is very helpful for people, not just intellectually, but it also helps with this guilt shame problem a lot of people have around loneliness. Like, I haven't met somebody yet who's guilty about being thirsty. I just haven't. Or being cold. I mean, we just say these are signals. So what is it about loneliness? And I actually think it gets to the question is, what is it we want to be connected to? Yeah. And I won't go more deeply into it other than to suggest that connection with other people is important. It is kind of this social psychology testing. Yeah. And many of the surveys we use, UCLA loneliness scale being one of the most dominant ones, 20 items about, how often do you feel? And many of those items really relate to exclusion or connection to other people. I think there is a significant aspect of loneliness, which is around connection to oneself. Yeah. And I think it's important we bring that into the light a little bit and in a more declarative way. I think a lot of that goes back to work, or understanding of that goes back to actually a sociologist, Emil Durkheim, around the turn of the last century, recognizing that the rapid changes of the modern world, where people would come from farms and then go to the industrialized cities in Europe, and all the norms, all the rituals were changed. People didn't know what it meant to connect and belong, because everything was just up in the air. And this is obviously before Freud, before the psychological concept of mind and psyche. And there were suicide clusters in Europe. And the Durkheim's book, I think it was 1840 or 1896, something like that, was suicide. It was called Suicide. So I think we're back into that right now. I think what's happened over the last 20 years is the rapid kind of, it's like a Jenga tower being thrown up in the air. Where are the rituals? Where are the routines? Think about the pandemic. We've restructured routines around everything from working to dying, and we're doing it in different ways. So anomie, without norm or without measure, which was Durkheim's word in French that's become a cognate in English and it's used in psychology, is the rule of the day, particularly for younger adults, which I think actually goes a long way to explaining why there's so much despair in that population right now. It's not exactly depression. It's a deep disorientation around connection. And Catherine, I'm sure your work is focused on that as well. Maybe you've got some thoughts.
Yeah, well, thank you both for all those thoughts. Those are really fascinating. Your reference to Durkheim makes me think of your poetry experience, actually, just as a slight tangent, but I believe he's the person who coined the term collective effervescence, which is the feeling we get when we're in a group of people and you feel this energy from the group. And I think is something that we've really been missing for the past 2 years, that kind of joyful energy that can come just from being around other human beings. And Adam Grant wrote a really interesting editorial at some point in the last year about that, the collective effervescence, which is very hard to say, I'm realizing now. Mostly I wanted to say, well, just to thank Julianne for that point, because I don't think that many people, I think in the general population, many people now know that stress is associated, chronic stress is associated with hormonal changes in our bodies that increase our risks for disease. It's not good to be chronically stressed out, but I don't think the loneliness aspect is as well or as commonly acknowledged or understood. So I just want to really emphasize that it's a big deal because it is affecting us physiologically in ways that increase risk for disease. And the other thing I was going to say is just a note of empathy for all of us on this call, because I'm assuming that if you're on this call, it's probably not just an intellectual exercise that you're spending an hour with us to discuss loneliness because you just think it's kind of academically interesting, right? Like you're probably feeling kind of lonely. And I just want to say that I think we all are. And I think that we can seem like we're all doing okay. And certainly if you look at people's social media feeds, maybe they'll seem like they're okay. But people are not really doing okay right now. And so I just wanted to throw that out there as an empathy thing. I was mentioning this yesterday, but I recently had an experience myself where I traveled for the first time in 2 years, and I went to this conference and it was very stimulating. There were all these people and I had all these social interactions and it was really amazing. And then at the end of the conference, I got into the elevator and I had to hold back tears, and I got back to my hotel room and I actually did start crying, which is not my normal thing to do. I'm in a hotel room right now. I'm not crying. But it was this feeling, I think, of realizing what I and we have missed. So anyway, I just want to throw that out there that if you're struggling, you're not alone.
Thank you, Catherine. I mean, amazing perspective, and it really helps us to understand loneliness more. My thoughts are that the subjective feeling of loneliness does seem to be pervasive. I mean, I'm not sure if it's increased compared to previous eras, but it is something that people are experiencing. It, like you've just said now, it doesn't necessarily reflect social isolation. It's a disconnection from potentially ourselves, from others, from life. So I guess my question would be here, what are some of the ideas, if we want to get practical for people now, what are some of the ways that people can increase the sense of connection and belonging that they're seeking? If I just bring my own personal experience into this, I probably feel less lonely when I'm playing my guitar or walking in the woods than when I'm in a group of people. I feel less lonely in that way. So that's my own personal experience, and I'm sure people maybe experience it slightly differently, but I would just love to hear, how can people practically start to increase this sense of connection in their lives? And I guess start with Jeremy.
It's the central question. And I wanted to thank Catherine for two things before I share a thought. One is for recognizing that no one's on this webinar by accident. Certainly not the panelists, because we're all quietly intrigued by the topic. Steve, your whole organization is focused on it. And the second thing I wanted to thank Catherine for is what she just did, which was to describe a moment in her own life, which many people would say would be a vulnerable moment. Maybe some people would even say it was a weak moment. And that's how we connect, is by sharing something human and authentic and tolerating momentarily the discomfort of disclosure, which in Western societies is very hard to do because people feel at risk when they do that. But we can decide not to feel at risk. I mean, It's not a law of science that we're going to be at risk when we disclose something. We've just come to believe it's true. So when you think, what can we do about loneliness? I would suggest the first thing we can do is get deeply curious about it. If you're feeling the discomfort or the despair of loneliness, you're naturally going to feel anxious about that because it is a risk state, right? It goes back to what Julianne said. You know, I'm lonely. We're the people who are going to help me defend myself from saber-toothed tigers. Of course, you're going to be anxious because there are real tigers out there. Those are metaphorical, but they're real. So how do you get past the anxiety? And a lot of our programming really starts with giving people invitations to be curious. And so curiosity is a gateway. There's a lot that's been written about it. I actually think it's neurophysiologic too. You know, the actual brain chemistry work on curiosity is just starting to form up, and the functional MRI scans also. But it's a very active brain state. What's most interesting about it to me is it actually then takes you to the next thing, which you get to then use your imagination, you get to explore ideas, you get to have conversations you otherwise wouldn't have. Something we promote a lot at the Foundation for Art and Healing is creative expression. To draw, to doodle, to write a poem, to dance, to move, to pick up your guitar, Steve. And then you've made something. So be curious, express yourself. And for many people, that's just transformative. For some people, when they add to that, doing it as a group and have conversations, then they reach a very, very different and very positive state of connection, both to themselves and to other people. And we try to give people the tools and the skills to develop those experiences. We think it's available to anyone, actually. Any age, any background, don't have to be creatively talented. You just have to be curious and be willing to take the risk.
I love that, and it resonates so much with myself. Julianne, your thoughts on this?
Yeah, so, you know, from the scientific community in terms of trying to understand what factors put people at risk for loneliness, to see how that might inform how we might go about trying to actually reduce that. And unfortunately, many of the factors that put people at risk are often outside their control. And so, for instance, or at least very difficult to modify. So for instance, we find, and we did a survey, I'll just give an example, but of course, there are many other studies, but we did a survey during the pandemic that included 101 countries. It was in 10 languages, to try and understand what people's experiences were and who might be most, who might be suffering most. And what we found was that those who were living with others were significantly less likely to report severe loneliness, but that's not always easy to change. Those who reported their financial circumstances were poor, also were significantly more likely to report loneliness. Again, something very difficult to modify. Those who reported poor physical health and poor mental health also were more likely to report greater severity of loneliness. And so, first of all, it's important to recognize that some of the things that lead to loneliness may be very difficult to modify. And so that has also been an incredible challenge to identifying ways to help reduce risk for people. And so so I just want to, preface this by saying that we have very, very, very robust evidence in terms of some of the consequences of loneliness. But when it comes to preventing it or reducing it, that evidence is a little bit more mixed. And that's because what might work for one person's circumstances may not necessarily work for someone else's. And so that's also, important to recognize that, one size doesn't fit all necessarily. And so it's important to really be cognizant of what kinds of barriers might exist in one's own life and what kinds of things may be helpful. But Jeremy mentioned a few things that various programs that have been looked at. I'll just point to another one that we did a large international randomized controlled trial where we just simply asked people to do small acts of kindness for others. And something as simple as that, just over 4 weeks, we found resulted in reductions in loneliness and reductions in social isolation, as well as reductions in perceptions of conflict. And so that's something that not only can anyone do because it doesn't require any training, it doesn't require any costs. But what I thought was so remarkable about that is we only tested the person who was providing the acts of kindness, and presumably the person on the receiving end may have benefited as well. And so it's something that it's something that I think at least many of our parents would teach us as children is the best way to help yourself is to help others. And so it kind of goes along those lines, but may have the potential to not only help you but to potentially help others as well.
Sorry, I was going to say I love that. It's inviting more care and kindness and compassion, which I think is an amazing thing. In my mind, people would likely feel less lonely in a truly compassionate, kind world. So thank you for that. Catherine, any of your ideas in terms of how people can increase a sense of connection in their lives?
Sure. Yes, thank you both for those comments. I was going to say, Jeremy, you might know this already, but the curiosity thing, I love that you love curiosity so much, but I used to be a Latin teacher, so I have to start this by just saying the dorky aside that the word curious, as you may know, comes from the Latin cur, which C-U-R, which means why. I just love that. So you're someone who always asks why. Several thoughts come to mind. I think that in terms of practical strategies, so this is something I think about a lot because I'm realizing I obviously have a self-selecting audience and that the people who are reaching out to me are struggling from loneliness and isolation due to their relationships with technology. But I will say that one thing I think that really can help that goes back to what we were talking about in terms of vulnerability and being human is to ask yourself whether you're living your life or you're performing your life. Because there's a real pressure these days to perform your life, and that's fake. And that I think is a guaranteed recipe to feel lonely because you're not actually being yourself and you're not connecting with other people on a human level. So I think that going back to that theme of checking in with ourselves, asking yourself whether you're posting things because you really want to share them or are you performing in some way and looking for affirmation. I also love the idea, I think it's really helpful to think about how can we take the good parts of technology without getting the bad things. And one thing I personally have found useful, because I hate social media personally, I've got nothing, I don't want anything to do with it, but I like connecting with friends. I think creating ways to connect with people through technology that doesn't necessarily involve these platforms. For example, having a private Slack group with some of your friends where it's not to perform for external affirmation. You truly are, I've got a friend who's got multiple channels with her family, with her siblings and her parents, and they have this ongoing Slack group with their family that's private. Another thing that I love is a practice that I got from, or it's inspired by the book of Delights by the poet Ross Gay, which is a lovely book. And in it, or for it, Ross Gay wrote an essay every day for a year about something that delighted him. That's not the practice, don't worry. But what he does is he just trains himself to notice things that delight him. And as he puts it in his book, the more he notices delights, the more delights reveal themselves to him. He compares it to tuning into a radio frequency, which is delightful. I found it so inspirational. I actually have a bracelet on my wrist that I had made. It's like a tattoo, but less commitment, that says delight on it. The other one says pay attention. But basically what you do is you just make a point of going about your day. And when you notice something that delights you, you put it, this is important. It sounds silly, but you have to put a finger in the air and say out loud, delight. Because the act of noticing, naming, accompanying with a physical gesture and saying something out loud actually does have scientific evidence behind it as a way to boost your mood. Even better is to then share that with someone. So going back to the theme of how do we use technology to truly foster connection, I have a lot of text message chains going on right now that are just delight text message chains where I have groups that, of friends in California I haven't seen literally in years at this point. And every once in a while, I'll just get a text that has a picture of something and it just says delight. You know, a friend from Boston over the winter sent me a picture of frost crystals on his car windshield and it said delight. And I love that in particular, because I think it's a good example of what this practice is getting at, which is that he had a choice in that moment to be upset that his car had ice on it and that he was maybe going to be late and have to scrape the car off, whatever. Or he could notice the beauty of those crystals, take a picture for his friend Catherine, that's me, and then send it to me with delight. And I think that speaks to the fact that there's a real power in training our brains to focus more on the positive aspects of life. And it's worth noting that naturally our brains are going to want to notice the negative stuff because that's a survival mechanism. It's essentially scanning our environments for threats, right? Like it's just, if there's actually something that's going to kill you, you want to notice it really quickly. But right now we're doing what people were talking about in the chat there, where they're basically, we're finding ourselves like reading negative news that causes fear and anxiety, even though we're not actually doing anything about it in that moment. So there's a real benefit in trying to train ourselves to focus on the positive. And not in a Pollyanna-ish way, but just reorienting ourselves. And then lastly, I would say, so my whole book, The Power of Fun, is about the power of what I think of as true fun, which is the confluence of playfulness and connection and flow. And I think that the more that we can prioritize experiences that create this Venn diagram of playfulness and connection and flow, the less lonely we're going to feel, perhaps tautologically because there's connection in there. But those are the moments in which we feel joyfully alive. So I would suggest to everyone that if you're struggling to think of what you can do, just take a bit of time to just think of some times in your life that you felt joyfully alive and very connected and present, the moments in which you had fun. And that might give you some ideas for things you could do or people you could spend time with, or even settings to put yourself in that will make you feel less lonely and isolated. And the last thing I would say is just, I do think it's interesting how we do feel this compulsion to keep scanning negative news out of this feeling of responsibility and this sense of guilt that if we focus on the positive, we're somehow not responsible people. And I just invite everyone to question whether we're actually helping anybody by making ourselves miserable reading the latest story about Ukraine, instead of doing something that might actually nourish us, fill up our energy reserves so that we then can go forth in the world and do something about it instead of just consuming content about it.
Thank you, Catherine. You're getting a lot of love for your delight chain strategy. And I mean, what you were saying at the very end is important because there's been quite a few comments coming through around people feeling like they don't have a sense of control of what's going on in the world, and therefore that leads towards doom scrolling, or people don't feel like a feeling of control over their actual technology use. One person mentioned it just feels like a real waste of time, you know, and given that the average person is on this earth for 4,000 weeks, it feels like time is precious. So my question to all of you here is, this is a common experience for all, and it's common for a reason, because, you know, a lot of the, you know, big tech companies and media companies, they've gamed our attention to a degree. It's quite easy to become trapped by, you know, digital technology use and scrolling. So what I wanted to know is, have you come across any research, or do you have any practical ideas for how people can combat that in their lives, how they can combat the potentially negative effects of digital technology?
You know, I think it's what Catherine said. I mean, and that's why you can just see how we all respond, Catherine. That was so beautifully said. I mean, and you know, I don't think we need an actual playbook. I mean, it's just pay attention. And if it feels motivating, exciting, we recognize that feeling and do more of it. You know, and I actually think technology can leverage tremendous positive change, but only if you do it humanistically and aware and with a sense of awareness. And, you know, even texting a beautiful photograph or some link to something to somebody else brightens their day and your day. Let's do more of it. Now, I also don't want to lose track of something very important that Julianne said, though, which is, you know, and this has been going around, you know, modernity may be the same storm, but we're all in different boats. There are a lot of people who don't have the privilege or the ability to navigate the digital world with curiosity and grace and enthusiasm and play, because they're busy trying to figure out, you know, how to get their kids off crack or how to find a place for them to live that day. And so we have to somehow come up with a global model where no one's left behind. This is easier to say than to do, but I actually think no one in a way can be unlonely unless we're all unlonely. I think it is a collective issue, and we feel it. We feel the misery of what's going on in Ukraine. I know we all do, and not just the Ukraine, all around the world. So whatever we do has to balance the joy and delight of a personal breakthrough, exhilaration, connecting with a friend, with some sense of a connection to the global opportunity. You know, I know that sounds a little bit like a soapbox speech, but I think it's really important.
Definitely, I hear you, Jeremy. And Julianne and Catherine, or Julianne, first.
No, it's hard to follow up with from both of those because I think they so brilliantly captured that. And, you know, I really loved what Catherine was saying, because I think not only does it resonate on such a personal level for each one of us, but, you know, to add to what both Catherine and Jeremy was saying is that whether it's online or offline, we see that when we put out something that is positive, people are more likely to respond in positive ways than in negative ways. And when we put out things that are negative, they're more likely to respond in negative ways. And this, unfortunately, can lead to a downward spiral among people who are lonely if they're expecting kind of negativity from others. And that can often reinforce that. And what Catherine described was just such a critical pathway in which you can turn that into an upward spiral. And in fact, there's been a lot of research on gratitude practices, because often by expressing something that you appreciate about someone, that in turn, you know, is likely to elicit a very positive response. And, you know, I love the example of the ice crystals. And because I imagine when you got that text of that image, it wasn't just the image, but it also demonstrated that that person was thinking about you, right? And thought that you would appreciate it. And so that had to make you feel really good. And so then you probably responded in a very positive way. And that these kinds of just simple exchanges are what can build social bonding over time and are so easy yet so powerful. And can, I think, also, as she mentioned, put us in a better position to feel empowered and the strength to do more good in the world, and think about how we can address some of the larger social issues rather than feeling more and more helpless and out of control in this world.
I mean, I love how this has gone beyond just like, here are 5 strategies you can use to combat your phone use. I mean, this gets to the heart of the matter. I think that's really, really important. I would like to bring some guests' questions into the conversation now, if you don't mind. So I'm going to pull some out of the Q&A and pose them to the 3 of you, and feel free to answer. So this first one is it's more of a statement, but there's definitely a question in here. It's from Letitia. And Letitia says, it's a challenge to tell and teach kids to be curious when they grow up in the time of computer games and social media and the like, especially after the pandemic when online was their only way to connect at times. So I guess just the question under this is how, perhaps as a parent or people in general, do we support kids through this? And
Art supplies. You know, one of the things that's amazing for kids is they're all artists, and they haven't kind of had the, you reach a stage, you know, you make stuff. And then I had this with my sister at one point. She said, oh my God, that's ugly, you know, and I didn't want to do art after that. But, you know, but kids aren't, they're natural artists, and they want to explore, and, you know, whether it's construction paper, glitter, glue, all of that. And then that's how curiosity manifests. I don't want to oversimplify it, but I mean, and then take them out on walks in the woods, take them to see a waterfall. and then have them come back and give them the art supplies, right? And then, so that's what happens. And then suddenly they say, wow, this is how it feels. And it's like, whether you call it flow state, as Catherine said, but they're in it. And so then, of course, now we're taking art classes out of schools. We're making it harder to do that. I mean, because we're now saying, oh, let's have more STEM classes, and let's kind of balance to the left side of the brain the rational analytic capabilities, because people do well in careers afterwards. It's not clear that that's always the full measure of success, but so I think there are things we can do, but I think we have to get creative about it.
Thanks, Jeremy.
Yeah, I'll add to that. One of the things that I thought was super interesting that just goes into, right along and supporting what Jeremy just said is, in addition to the creative arts, there's been quite a bit of research now that is showing that time spent in nature is associated with lower loneliness, and has a variety of physical and mental health benefits, and so it's not just the fact that you're being physically active, but also we were talking about it earlier. Not only is it a connection to others and maybe connection to self, but connection to something larger, and so that might be part of it as well. But you're also more likely to, in terms of curiosity, nature is constantly changing and evolving, and there's noises and the sights, and there's so much to take in, that even all of these things combined are having such powerful effects. And so I think it might sound like a very simple kind of trite answer, oh, just go spend some time in nature. But really there's a robust multiple pathways by which this time in nature might actually have significant benefits.
Thank you, Julian. Yeah, and Catherine.
Oh yeah, that was just dropping in the chat. There's some great, in terms of kids in particular in nature. I don't know if I'm getting the guy's last name right, but it's Richard something with Last Child in the Woods and Vitamin N. But I wholeheartedly agree with what's been said. I would also say, I think that in order to cultivate curiosity in our children, we need to not just tolerate, but embrace boredom more. And that goes for us in addition to our kids. And so, I mean, right now, the tendency is to just hyper stimulate ourselves and our children. I get horrified every time I see like a little kid in a stroller with an iPad or an iPhone. They make strollers with iPad and iPhone holders for the kids now. And to me, that's just so upsetting, because it's a stage where a child is just naturally so interested in the world. And instead we're training them to just look at the screen with this bombardment of information. And just one anecdote that comes to mind, and the value of boredom. It's also worth thinking, there's a lot of brain changes that happen when you're constantly distracting yourself. So if you feel like you can't concentrate and read a book at all anymore, by the way, it's probably because you've trained yourself to be so distractible from the dopamine hits from your devices, but that's a different story. But this anecdote that really stood out to me when I was writing How to Break Up with Your Phone was about Lin-Manuel Miranda, the, I might say, creative genius who wrote Hamilton, who told this story. It was a parenting interview, I want to say in GQ. And anyway, he talked about how he had once spent a ride home as a child with his friend. I want to say the kid's name was Danny, and his friend spent 2 or 3 hours just interacting with a stick. And the stick was like all sorts of different characters, and he was acting things out. And Lin-Manuel Miranda said that he needed to up his own creativity game after watching his friend do this. So I think we're just able to be creative. And as a side Hamilton story, as you can tell, I'm a fan. If anyone is a fan out there, he has this great story about how he wrote Wait for It, one of the most important songs in the musical, while he was taking a subway from his home in Washington Heights in New York down to a friend's birthday party in Brooklyn. And he was on the train, and this song just came to him. So he started writing frantically. He goes to the birthday party, says happy birthday, gets right back on the train. By the time he gets home, he's written one of the most important songs in the show. That was before there was internet access in the subway. And having glanced at his Twitter feed, I just feel like if he hadn't had that space, and if he had been in a situation where there was Wi-Fi in the subway, that song might not exist. We need to give our brains space to think creative thoughts. And we also need to pay attention to our experiences in the moment, because if you don't actually pay attention in the moment, you'll have no experiences to remember, and therefore no fodder for creative thoughts or insights. And that's true for us in addition to our children. So long story short, be bored. It's good for us.
I would love to just add one thing that reminded me, what you were just saying is, I once came across a quote, and I might be paraphrasing it, so if I get it wrong, but it's something to the effect of, children have never been very good at obeying their elders, but they have never failed at imitating them. And as a parent, that's somewhat frightening, but our children do look to us as models. And so our own behavior can carry a tremendous amount of weight in terms of how they behave as well. And so if we want our children to be curious, we need to be curious as well.
I love that. Thank you, Julianne. There's 5 minutes to go, so time seems to have rushed by, and I haven't noticed it passing by at all, which I think is a good sign. I think we've been in collective flow here. So when I come back for some of your final messages soon, I just want to thank you all so much for being part of this conversation today. I want to thank the audience as well, and for sharing all your questions. I'm sorry I didn't have a chance to get to all of them, but I know that you've all been witness to some amazing insights and just some sort of soul stuff to get us to really reflect on this topic in a far more deeper way than we might have come into this conversation thinking we might, which I think is amazing. And I've really valued the different perspectives that the three of you brought to this conversation. And what's been great is that there's been this beautiful thread of like consciousness and awareness and kindness and compassion and joy throughout all of yours. So thank you so much. Before we say our goodbyes, I'm going to invite the three of you to just briefly share maybe just some recommendations for the audience when it comes to maybe books or courses or podcasts or any resources that you think might add value to this conversation or be helpful for people in their lives. And then just end with one final message for everyone to take home with them. And we can start with Julianne.
That's a tough one. Oh, I wish I was going last instead of first.
Sorry.
There are so many resources out there. And so, if you want to get the scientific side of things, I can refer you to, the National Academy's report, or, even if you go to my website, I've got a list of articles, but my guess is that most people are looking for more of something that they can turn to that might help them in the moment. And I would say my go-to would be, think of someone in your life that you really care about that could use a phone call, or reach out to them. And I would say that would be my number one thing, is reach out to someone you care about and let them know how much you care about them.
Thank you so much, Julianne. And Jeremy.
Yeah, it's a great question. Like Julianne, there's so much out there and there's so much to say. And, but I do want to promote some of the work we're doing with Project Unlonely and a very specific aspect of what we do that might be fun for people. So before you can do all these wonderful things, to kind of explore loneliness, you have to be aware of it. You have to not be afraid of it. So what we've been doing now, we're in the 5th season now, is we have an Unlonely Film Festival. So we're very fortunate. We partnered with the president of Lionsgate Film. He's the judge, Mike Pesserneck. He's moved on. He's an independent producer now, but he's a heavy hitter in Hollywood. So a lot of filmmakers will submit short films on loneliness. That's the through line. And we curate these films into bite-sized experiences that people can see on their own, but they're a lot of fun to watch with other people. This is the power of technology. You can do it on FaceTime now. You could stream from a website with FaceTime, and several people can be watching a film together and have conversations. Or you can do it in around the dinner table. So if you come to artandhealing.org, and Steve will give you material you can send to everybody who tuned into this webinar. We're launching our 6th season on June 5th. It'll be like the Oscars, only not as many people are going to come. 7 p.m. Eastern. late for the UK folks. And we're going to have a good time. We have 3 incredible films that won awards this year. We're going to screen each one in its entirety. You're going to hear from the filmmakers, and then we're going to have a little group watching kind of thing. And it's just an example, of simple things you can do to share, explore this topic, have the conversations that allow us to be real, connect, take risks, and, as Catherine said, be in that flow state and have fun.
Thank you, Jeremy. And Catherine.
Yeah, thank you both for those suggestions. So this is kind of what I do. Realizing as I have lots of other suggestions for other people's stuff too, but I guess I probably should mention again, How to Break Up With Your Phone is a look at what our screen time is doing to us. It was inspired by my own experience being with my baby daughter, finding her looking up at me as I was looking down at my phone and being horrified by it, and realizing I needed to have a much more intentional relationship with my device. And I became really curious about what the interaction I was having with technology was actually doing to me physiologically. So that is a look at that with the 30-day plan for how to take back control. And then, as I alluded to, once I spent less time on my phone, I had a lot more free time, and I freaked out because at some point I realized, oh my goodness, I've lost sight of how I want to fill my own time, because I've just gotten used to filling the time with stuff on my phone. So that led to me writing The Power of Fun. So I would suggest both of those, because they both have very practical steps in them. And I actually just created 2 courses based on those books. Let me see if I can share this link, because I made a link just for Unmind. One is a step-by-step. They're text message-based courses, so they're delivered on your phone, where I would argue you need it the most, especially with the phone breakup. And they've got little audio messages from me, and then daily prompts that walk you through some of the steps. Nice. Just to share one of those with you, I actually had my phone near me, not to be distracted, but I did want to share you like one suggestion, because I do think to be connected, you got to get better at getting your phone out of your hand, and you have to reduce the number of times it notifies you, which really should be called interruptions. I just wanted to show my home screen, because I realized I can do show and tell in Zoom in a way that I can't with other things. I don't have any apps on it other than these things at the bottom. And if I want to actually call up an app, I have to pull that down and type in the app that I want. And just making little changes like that to your phone can actually make a big difference in how often you're interrupted. And that in turn can give you the ability to be present and interact with people in real life. So I think the last thing I would say is just the message that I personally came away from when I wrote How to Break Up With Your Phone, which I've alluded to already, but is basically that our lives are what we pay attention to. You're not going to experience what you don't pay attention to, and you're not going to remember it. And so every time we're making a decision in the moment about what to pay attention to, we're actually making a much bigger decision about how to live our lives. And that is under our control. And there's no right or wrong answer to that question. But that is why my other bracelet says pay attention, because I just want to make sure that I'm living my life in a way that is meaningful to me. So if that's useful to people, I'd like to share that.
Thank you so much, Catherine. Thank you again, Julianne. Thank you, Jeremy. We'll share the resources with everyone. I guess here's to more curiosity, more joy, more kindness, and ultimately more connection with ourselves and others. And yeah, thank you all so much for joining us. I've really enjoyed just being here today with you all, and hope to see you at the next Unmind event. So thank you, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day, I think it is, or your evening, your morning, whatever it might be. Cheers, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.